All right, hi everyone. We'll give everyone a couple more minutes to filter in, and then we'll get going. One more minute. All right, since we are recording it, I'm going to get going, and we'll share the recording at the end of this. So anyone who wasn't able to make it, or if you have to hop up early, you're welcome to get caught up. So my name is Alex Kelly. I lead the broadband team at the Center on Rural Innovation, and I want to just start by saying a few quick words about what we're going to do today and what we're going to do over the series of boot camps that the Appalachian Regional Commission has put together in collaboration with our team and the team at the National Broadband Resource Hub. So as you all know more than anyone else, public sector officials and community leaders are being asked to become broadband experts to navigate the many federal and state funding priorities and opportunities that are ongoing right now. And it's a tricky business. It's a tricky thing to know from a technological standpoint, strategy standpoint, and every community is dealing with broadband and broadband challenges in their own ways. And so we have put together a series of boot camps that are meant to cumulatively address the various topics that public sector officials and their allies need to know to be successful and help make sure their communities have good broadband outcomes when we get through the other side. So today this is our first session, so thank you all for attending. We'd love if everyone can join us for all 6. If not, please join for the ones that feel most relevant to your situation. We'll also have recordings and decks we'll be able to share on the other end. But today, because it's the first one and wanted to kind of kick us off right, we're going to have a shorter presentation than usual, mainly to go over some foundational concepts, terms, vocabulary, and we're going to end with a little bit more discussion than we might ordinarily have, so that we can hear from you all what specifically you really want to make sure we cover through these boot camps. We'll have a Q&A session today, just in case you want to dive right into whatever is going on in your particular jurisdiction. And we'll try to get the book learning stuff and vocab out of the way today, so that we can go farther in the subsequent sessions. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, but we are just in a meeting format, so feel free to bring yourself off mute and ask a question and interrupt if you would like. You're also welcome to put things in the chat. And just one more thing before we begin to give you the arc of it. Again, 6 sessions. We'll have them at the same time every week. And next week, we are going to tackle overview of the broadband planning process and approaches to expanding infrastructure. Then in subsequent weeks, we're going to tackle mapping and data, right? Using mapping and data to understand your needs and do planning and cost estimation. We're going to talk about partnership models because there are 100 partnership models under the sun, all that can work for broadband, and figuring out what the right one for you is super important. Then we're going to have a session on funding and financing across public, private, state, local, etc. And then lastly, we're going to have a session on some of the digital inclusion stuff, right? Making sure everyone in your community can participate, which is really the end goal of all this and what really elevates everyone's quality of life, housing values, satisfaction, education, workforce, and so forth. All right, and I not to do more throat clearing, but Curtis, our hardest working person at the Appalachian Regional Commission, can't join us for this session, but he said he will join us for subsequent sessions, and so he sends his regards. Okay, foundations of broadband. You are hearing from me. Curtis will join us for subsequent sessions, and Anderson was not able to make it today as well. So you're just going to be hearing me talk for this time, but you will see all of these folks in subsequent sessions. And so what I wanted to start with, not to make it too much like school, is a very, very brief history of telephony, of the landline telephone systems in our country, because not only has that really shaped our broadband landscape right now, but telephone companies that were started 100 years ago are becoming more and more relevant and more interested in fixing broadband challenges today. So I'm not going to go through this year by year, but the long and short of it is, after the telephone was invented, much like broadband feels sometimes, the denser areas tend to get service faster, right? Because there's more customers. And sometimes it feels like there's only one provider in your area and there's a bit of a monopoly. And so you have less control over prices or customer service or things like that. That was true for the telephone since its invention. And one of the interesting things that the federal government did was, at a certain point, they said, well, we know we need everyone to be connected to the telephone. It is just such a productivity boost that they created, they did a couple things. One, they implemented some regulations to prevent the telephone monopoly from getting too out of hand, right? Raising their rates too much. And they also implemented programs to help people fill in the gaps in where the private sector was willing to build the telephone networks. So the big
Tom Smith.
Yeah.
Join the meeting.
The big telephone companies, the ones that deployed, usually mostly with their own funding to the dense areas, we call those ILECs, incumbent local exchange carriers. But the government implemented programs for mostly farmers to kind of fill in the gaps with a little elbow grease and the grit and tenacity that we know has been a part of the nature of our of rural areas for the history of this country. So those entities are called RLECs, rural local exchange carriers. And again, wanted to just explain that because they have major community infrastructure, right? They've got telephone lines, they've got utility poles, and they are increasingly willing to help close the digital divide with deploying high-speed broadband as well. Now, the other major, historical context here that's really important to connectivity today is cable, right? Your Comcasts, your Charter, Those are some of the biggest internet providers today, especially wired internet that travels along cables. Cable TV started as unidirectional, right? You had signals coming from the head end through the wires into your home, delivering the television, but nothing could be sent in the other direction. As the technology progressed, and two-way data transmission became possible, right? Cable TV providers started providing broadband as well. There was a point in time where cable overtook DSL in terms of speed, and then they overtook DSL in terms of market penetration. And they kind of became the new, the new monopoly of good broadband service. Unlike the ILECs and the RLECs we just talked about, obviously, which are obligated to serve every premise in their area, at least every on-grid premise, cable television and cable internet providers are not in the same way, at least. And so you have the same kind of development patterns now that you had in the very beginning of telephony, where those big ISPs, they build where they get the best ROI, which is in the population dense areas. Last bit of context, I promise, before we dive into more contemporary stuff. The history of broadband is one of technological innovations driving faster speeds, which then encourages more usage, and which then results in more people inventing new types of technology and software that require faster speed, which starts the cycle all over again. So as we've gone from the beginning of dial-up through DSL, cable, and fiber, speeds have increased, as well as the programs that we use have required faster and faster speeds. So part of the big challenge today is, how do we set ourselves up to deploy an infrastructure that lasts for decades, so that we don't have to keep going through this cycle of inventing something, deploying it, figuring out how to fill in the gaps, inventing something new, deploying it, having more gaps, and that need to be filled in. That brings us to some terminology and technology, but anybody want to comment on the first section? I'll just pause for 15 seconds in case anyone has any questions, comments, or complaints. Okay. So part of the reason why broadband deployment, especially learning about broadband deployment for the first time, is so complicated is because there are so many dang types of technology that work, and but they all have different features to them. They all have different pros and cons, and they all have usually well-funded people behind them claiming that they are the best type of technology. The reality is there's a bunch of different technologies that work better in different types of contexts. And so getting into the nuances of what your particular challenge is really important to knowing what type of technology will actually be the best to serve your needs. So you can generally break things down into wired and wireless. Wired is, as the name implies, connected via a wire the whole way, essentially. Wireless uses radios to send broadband signals through the air, at least usually in the last mile deployment from to the end user. Some specifics here. I don't need to go through DSL because a lot of us have lived with that, at least a good part of our lives. And cable and fiber, I talked about a little bit. What I do want to say, though, is the cable and fiber both deliver speeds that are perfectly great for most modern contexts. Video conferencing, doing homework, doing learning, video games, Netflix, all that. Cable tends to have much slower upload speeds than fiber, and upload speeds are the speeds that it takes to send things from your location back out to the internet, whereas fiber tends to have symmetrical speeds. So there's a little bit of a benefit to fiber if you are using upload intensive technologies. And the other thing that is well documented with fiber is that, you know, you can get pretty good speeds now with cable and fiber. Scientists are working on just astronomically higher speeds technology that will be able to use existing fiber infrastructure in the next 3 to 5 years. So whereas it's fairly common to be able to get a gigabit upload and download, some places have rolled out 25 gigabit symmetrical. They're working on 100. So by far the most R&D money is going to fiber, because generally the industry sees that as having the best potential to scale in terms of speeds with the needs of everyday people. Quick bit on the wireless side of things. Fixed wireless and mobile cellular are very similar. Main difference is whether you are transmitting signals, ones and zeros, right, to a fixed point, a fixed receiver, or to a cell phone or something that can move around. All of these types of wireless technologies, they are impacted by barriers in between where the transmitting radio is and the endpoint is. That could be leaves, weather, hills, walls, so forth, right? And they tend to fade, the signal tends to fade more with distance, depending on what the frequency you're using and some other things. Rather than go too deep in the weeds with this, I would say, the general takeaway that I try to convey with wireless is that it's cheap, fast to deploy, but generally, if you want a product that's going to work well, you have to do a lot of due diligence to make sure that your particular configuration, the frequency, the location, where customers are, and so forth is going to make it a good product. So it can work great. It also can be a little frustrating for those of you who have tried to do a Zoom call on some wireless networks. Satellite, same propagation issues as wireless, where trees, so forth, can get in the way. There's a couple different types of satellite internet at the moment. The one people usually ask about is our good friend Elon Musk and his Starlink service, which if you've talked to anyone who uses it, I've heard pretty good things about it, especially for people who live way off the grid or in a camp. It is not going to get to the super fast speeds that we see with fiber or even cable. And it may be limited in how fast it can scale in the future. But in general, if you don't have access to that type of technology, it seems to be working pretty good for people. So I've used some of these terms already, so I apologize, but I will quickly define some of the things that I've been talking about. Right, the speed of data transmission for technologies is measured in megabits per second. 1,000 megabits is equal to a gigabit. So when I say fiber can commonly provide a gigabit symmetrical service, that means 1,000 over 1,000 megabits. Download and upload speeds, these are pretty intuitive. It's how fast can you send signals into your house to your computer via the internet versus out of your house via the internet. And with every service except for fiber, typically the download speeds are faster than the upload speeds. Last thing on this page is that the current FCC definition of broadband, which they consider good internet, is 25 over 3. You can achieve 25 over 3 in some instances with DSL. You have to be very close to certain types of network equipment in order to do that, right? The farther out you go along the telephone lines, essentially, the slower it gets. Cable is also pretty good at getting 25.3. Fiber, blows that out of the water. But it really depends on the system and some other factors. So I talked a little bit about generally, why the industry is moving towards deploying fiber, if at all possible. Again, it's the ability to scale speeds as bandwidth needs increase, right? As soon as I buy my augmented reality goggles and try to do cooperative games with people, I'm going to want as fast a speeds as possible. I'm kidding about that. I'm not planning on doing that, but if you did, and I think the other things is that it's though it is a little bit more capital intensive up front to deploy, the maintenance costs are quite low. It's got a really long shelf life, right? Fiber will last for 50, 60, 70 years without needing to be replaced. And in general, from a community well-being standpoint, it has the biggest impact on local economies and quality of life. So whether you measure that by jobs or wages or housing values and therefore tax revenues, fiber is what really makes a difference. One other little bit here on terminology. Try to not use new terminology too often, but some of the pieces that are hard to avoid talking about because they're so essential to the planning process are the names for different parts of fiber networks. So you've got three here. I'm going to start with last mile because that's the most intuitive. The last mile part of the network is the part that runs down the street and connects to the houses and the businesses. So when you are trying to solve the problem of the last 2 miles of the dirt road, where there's 3 houses that don't have good internet, that is the last mile, right? That's one of the biggest gaps in rural areas. Is there, we need to extend the last mile infrastructure farther to reach those houses. Middle mile is it's a part of the network that basically connects the major service areas. Usually when you deploy a network, right, everything has to be connected via wires. That's to be all part of one network. And there are different kind of points where you aggregate a bunch of those last mile wires into one place for efficient routing of information and stuff like that. So those typically get collected and aggregated in what you would call a hub. And the hubs, in order to connect to each other and have a resilient network, are usually connected by something you would call middle mile. So you might have a county where you've deployed 3 hubs. From those hubs, extend all the last mile, but connecting them in a ring would be middle mile. And it's important to connect them in a ring so that if there's a break in that somewhere, the internet doesn't go down because there's a kind of redundant route. The last piece of terminology here that's important to go over is backhaul. As you probably know, the entire internet across the country, across the world, is connected by wires. There are cables underneath the oceans connecting all the continents. There are wires going everywhere from everywhere to everywhere. But that connection to the global network of fiber that comprises, the global internet is called backhaul. So this is an important piece of terminology because sometimes this is one of the biggest issues in rural areas, right? If you have a town that isn't served, but it's fairly dense, and so kind of, there seems like there might be a business case to, just build a network there and have it work, but it will take but you need to connect to the internet, and the closest place to connect to the internet via backhaul is 40 miles away. That really impacts your costs, right? So you need to figure out how to get your particular town not only connected in a local network, but connected to the internet as a whole via backhaul. So there's one of the interesting, one of the, what's the word I'm looking for? One of the implications of the entire global internet system just basically being a collection of interconnected fiber optic cables is that fiber cables are needed for not just connecting your, homes and businesses, but basically all of our communications runs through fiber cables at some point. Every time you make a call on your cell phone, that's going to a tower first, but then it's going and flowing through the network of fiber optic cables across the world. So a lot of people say, well, we don't have very good internet and we don't have very good cell coverage, so we'd like to tackle them both. The good thing is tackling the home broadband with fiber infrastructure should make it easier to tackle the cell service issue, because again, once you build fiber into a community, that fiber is going to be needed to feed cell phone towers as well. And so that's kind of another reason why fiber is really the route a lot of communities are taking, because again, if you want to facilitate 5G deployment in your community at some point, I'm not recommending it, I'm just saying if you're going to need fiber, as much fiber in your community as possible. So another bit of important terminology, and this is important as we start to think about some of the federal broadband funding programs, which we'll talk about. We could talk about today. Will also be full sessions on them. Is kind of what do we mean when we say un and underserved premises. So the way that a lot of the funding for broadband works is that they are allocating funding based on whether your town or your area or whatever area you're trying to serve is either unserved, underserved, or served. The general way to think about this is unserved is basically not having any broadband that's usable at all. Underserved, having a little bit of access but slow speeds. And served basically means access to broadband. Now, what the actual speed thresholds are for these definitions does depend by state sometimes. But basically, if you are unserved, you might be marked as having 4 megabits down and 1 megabit up. Underserved could be between 4.1 and 25.3, which is the federal definition of broadband, and served could be anything greater than that. Some states have started to call anything less than 25/3 unserved, 25/3 to 100/20 as underserved, and anything 100/100 or greater as served. So it kind of depends on what state you're in, but most states still consider everything 25/3 or below as un and underserved. Okay, I'm gonna pause there. Am I making any sense? Anything that I haven't gone over in terms of terminology and technology that you all have questions about? Okay. Thank you for the thumbs up, Nick. All right, pulling this back up. All right, so the last thing I wanted to talk about today before we get into some Q&A, and I'm excited to hear from you all about what you want to make sure to cover in these sessions and what questions you might have right off the bat, is just some of the barriers and benefits. Deploying infrastructure is hard, especially in the sparser areas, but also, frankly, in downtown urban areas and cities, right? There's different challenges in each. In the rural areas, lack of customer density means that's why we have a market gap, right? It can cost $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a mile or more to deploy broadband. And if you don't have enough customers, you can't generate enough revenue to pay back the capital expenditure. That's just basic math. Adoption rates, right? It's tricky. There are some communities where people really, really, really want broadband, and believe it or not, there are some communities where people don't. And there are other barriers to adoption besides like whether people want it or not. There's communities with lower median incomes have a harder time affording it. There are different barriers, whether it's language barriers, education and training barriers, right? Low adoption rates are a real challenge, and one that should be thought of throughout the whole broadband planning process. Even if you think you're just deploying infrastructure, this really has an impact on what you can do. Regulatory structures. One of the fun things about working in broadband is that every state is different. Every state has different rules about what funding can go to what types of broadband and how, who can be involved. Can you have electric co-ops involved? Can you have municipalities involved, and in what ways? So you have to kind of understand what's possible in your particular context from a regulatory standpoint. Lack of accessible and affordable middle mile and backhaul. We talked about this a little bit, right? It's not just the case that you need to connect all the homes in your community. You need to figure out how to connect the homes in your community to the broader internet. And another thing that has been really difficult historically is that to make a good business plan, to make a good network design, to understand exactly how much you're going to need to spend to build a network requires data, and it is really challenging to find good data that can lead to really accurate planning. So that's why we have a whole session on that, because in this day and age, there's data everywhere, but unfortunately, there is still not very good data to enable really accurate broadband planning. And so we need to, we have a session on how to address that. And the last thing is that there has been a lack of capital to spend on deploying broadband, at least to support filling in the gaps until now. So this is kind of the reason why we're here, trying to seize this moment of opportunity. I touched on this already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but we do encourage people to think about this holistically, because not only is it an infrastructure gap, there's affordability and adoption gaps too. And again, transition, right? The benefits of broadband are significantly increased the more we can work on all three of those pillars of access, adoption, and affordability. A lot of people consider internet a necessity, especially those of us who have had to work remotely or learn remotely over the past couple of years. And the research on the benefits of broadband has just been, continues to actually surprise me, because, it feels like a benefit. It obviously does, but to see it that kind of quantified is pretty cool. And I'm not going to go through these one by one, but there are a number of things here which are just really time and again proven to be real tangible benefits from having good broadband. Okay, I have a few prompt questions here in case people need prompting, but I will also open the floor to any type of Q&A that people may want to kick us off with. But in case you want the prompts, would love to know what the hardest part of navigating local broadband and telecom has been so far, wherever you are. And then, if I missed anything you wanted to know more about in terms of the technologies and the concepts, let me know. And then lastly, curious if you have an ideal case study or like peer community where you'd like to learn from something they've already done, what would that look like? So I will pull the deck down and open up the floor.
I was going to say, I know Ryan Collins might have some good suggestions, or even just good people that are doing this work right now. So Ryan, if you've got any thoughts, feel free to hop off mute if you can.
Hey, thanks, Anderson. Ryan Collins from Buckeye Hills Regional Council. First, to answer the first prompt, the biggest challenge we're running into in Ohio right now is what exactly does it look like to maintain the federal interest in a broadband project? Because a lot of internet service providers do not want to follow the classic model, which kind of takes a lien on the infrastructure. They look at that and they say, absolutely not. We do not want to do that. We don't want the federal government to hold our infrastructure over us. What else can we do? And so we're currently working to try and solve that issue here in Ohio. Some great people that are doing the work in Ohio. Broadband Ohio is a great organization to talk to in general. Our state broadband office is on it. They've been on it from the very beginning. I love working with them. Another one, not to toot my own horn, but here at Buckeye Hills, we've been working on broadband for over a decade now. I've been with the organization for almost 2 years now, and can say that we've been a front runner in the state of Ohio for quite a while. And so coming to us to talk about that, and then Tom Reed in the state of Ohio, he is a big advocate for broadband and broadband speeds, and particularly about bringing third-party data into broadband mapping to use to verify what ISPs provide to them. And then another organization is Broadband Access Ohio, just to talk about the different methods of deploying broadband. We're also a part of that organization, and the big focus there is that communities have a choice into how they want to deploy broadband, whether that's community broadband, whether it's doing public-private partnerships, whether it's capital investment, etc.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm writing all of that down too, just to make sure that we've got those organizations so that we can send them out to people afterwards. But thanks.
Perfect.
Anybody else want to?
That's awesome. Well, I would just like to say that the challenge you identified first is a real one, and one that many of the state broadband offices are grappling with. And so would love to also do some peer sharing as states develop their programs to understand who's figured out the right way to get around that. Curtis is with us now. Curtis, do you want to say hi and weigh in on that?
Yeah, Alex, and thanks for teeing up a great point, Ryan. I think that all the folks on the call who have tried to use ARC funding in the past to build broadband infrastructure are familiar with this same tricky ownership issue. And it's something that we're aware of and tracking right now as one of my top priorities, is trying to figure out how to structure ARC funding in a way that is attractive and as attractive as possible for private providers. Because while some public entities want to own and operate their own broadband networks, not all of them do. And so they have to find ways to attract those providers into their communities. It's heartbreaking. I have grantees right now in very rural, very distressed areas that have ARC money waiting for them. They just need to go find a private partner, and after multiple rounds of RFPs, they're unable to because of this same ownership restriction. So, like I said, we're working on it and hope to have some, guidance published soon, just so that we can help people use ARC money more efficiently, and then just thinking ahead to when those federal IIJA dollars are going to flow down to the states, and then the states start trying to hand it out to the local communities. ARC money is eligible as match for the BEAD funding, so we want to make sure that we have it figured out well ahead of that, so that we can maximize ARC's participation in that program.
Thank you, Curtis, for hopping on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
and
sorry.
for giving some color to that answer as well, because I think that right now everybody's just trying to figure out where's the next move coming in, and how do we formulate the best plan to make sure that every area gets service, and it's really hard to do right now. So Thanks, Ryan, for the note too. We really appreciate it. Anybody else? Questions, comments? You got some great folks on here with Alex and Curtis to be able to answer them if you need to.
This is Lauren from Pennsylvania, and I'm just really curious about what inroads have been made with some of the larger ISPs, getting them to actually negotiate around this federal interest. What strides have been made at this point in time that would be good models for us to use in other states?
Great question, Lauren. And that is something that, you know, I don't think this deck got into the intricacies of ARC funding, but ARC funding gets administered, as you know, by other agencies. For a construction project, it'll get, you know, handed off to maybe a state-based agency to administer the grant, and sometimes a federal agency to administer the grant. So where we're stuck right now, and I think what you were pointing out, is that different states and different federal agencies have, you know, gotten more creative than some of the other ones, or, you know, they've had more experience or more questions or more engaged grantees. And so they've paved some of the paths in this ownership nightmare. But one approach I've seen that seems to be working is using something other than pure ownership as a way to fulfill that requirement. So in the simplest approach, the public entity, the grantee, owns the asset, right? Easy. They have someone come in and maybe pay a small lease fee, and they get to operate the network and keep the revenues, and they're just acting as an operator. That's like the cleanest approach. The next cleanest is probably the lien, which I think what I'm hearing from Ryan and Lauren, and I know we talked about this morning with folks with the state, I guess the governor's office in Ohio. You know, the lien is not an attractive option for a large service provider. For small service providers, they might be okay with it, but large service providers view that as a non-starter. So we're also seeing other entities, in working with some of the biggest ISPs in the country, come up with even more creative approaches. One of them is like a very robust contract that includes take-back language. And I think that we can get even a little bit more creative with that than that if we consider things like some kind of broadband specific lease vehicles. One of them is called an IRU, or indefeasible rights of use. This is like a telecom industry, very specific, very heavy duty long-term lease, where maybe the grantee could own via this robust lease, you know, a set of fibers along the entire route of the infrastructure that's being built. So I think the IRU is an approach that we would consider as allowable. And then we're trying to get even more creative and even more flexible than that. And that's the thing that we're, you know, hoping to get published here in the next month or so. It would be, again, even more, I think, attractive to an ISP than that. So hopefully that answers your question, Lauren.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Anybody else with a good old question out there in broadband land? We're here to help anybody, or at least try to. And if we don't know the answer, we're gonna go chase it down for you after this. But just thank you all so much for the work that you're doing right now. We know that this is not an easy thing to learn, and it's something that you know, we're all here together on. And Kurt, popping up on there. Come off mute.
Yeah, I've got both of you, Curtis and Anderson. Right, I'm kind of a combination of both. So, hey, Kurt Anderson, Ithaca Area Economic Development in Ithaca, New York. Curtis, you and I know each other, obviously.
Yes.
A lot of what was covered today, we learned the hard way over the last year and a half about what you know. As we're all learning these things, it was just put into action because we received a broadband grant. I'm curious. I caught on to this this series late. Just curious if there's an agenda for what, you know, how this is going to progress, or what, you know, where we're starting is really good, and it's kind of the stuff that, again, we dealt with over the last year of what the heck is broadband. But what you know, where do we hope to end up, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I'm happy to share 6 sessions. The next upcoming 5 are as follows. Talk about the planning process. next? What are the different approaches to planning and expanding infrastructure? We'll have some case studies in here, we'll have some best practices, but we'll also get into how the planning process can change depending on your context and what you actually need to do and the funding you have, the data you have, and stuff like that. After that, this is going to be a March session, the using mapping and data. And there's a whole bunch of different things that mapping and data is essential for in the process. And unfortunately, the data that we have usually available to us is not ideal. And so we'll talk about how to kind of get around that, cobble together different sources, do survey work, and gonna get enough data to underpin a real robust plan and business plan, financial model, network plan, so forth. After that, we'll talk about different partnership models, because as we've kind of been discussing, and based on the questions and comments, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. Many of the large providers really want to own the infrastructure, but they will be okay with a 30-year IRU instead of that, right? Many small providers are willing to be flexible. There are many different types of public-private partnerships in that range that can work for different communities. So we'll get into the details there. We'll have a session on funding and financing, both public, private, local, state, federal. And then last session we'll have is on kind of some of the so what of broadband and some of the stuff that comes after the after you fix the infrastructure gaps, right? How do you get as many people to use the network as possible for the greatest benefit to your community? Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And I'm happy to hang on just for the next 15 minutes in case anyone wants to stick around and chat. But if not, see you next time.
Hey, at the risk of, sorry, it's Phil here. I'm gonna, at the risk of jumping in with a dumb question at the very end here.
No.
And apologies, I actually don't have a camera, so I'm sorry.
There's no such thing as a dumb question, Phil.
Well,
Truly, not on this call. There's not. Like, ask
well, okay. First off, I'm in Canada. I work in digital equity up here, and I'm kind of gathering information from a variety of resources across the continent around different rural, or I guess territorial approaches to broadband, basically expanding broadband. I'm very interested in the models and things happening in the United States and how they can be applied in areas in Canada, which has its own major areas of proximity and vast land masses to stretch and cover. But just in terms of data that you're getting around the positive impacts of, where are you getting your data from? Like, what are the primary sources you get? Are you creating your own data gathering? Are you conducting your own research? Or are they like federal statistics? Where are you getting the economic information from? Stuff like that.
Oh, the data on the impacts of broadband rather than data on like existing infrastructure that you might need for planning. Is that the distinction?
Sorry, I drank too much coffee and didn't phrase my question at all well.
No.
The question was, where do you get your like data around the positive economic impacts and outcomes for your community members, etc.?
Believe it or not, the folks who helped me put this slide deck together included an entire slide of citations.
Nice.
So I'm happy to send that your way so you can look at it. There's a number of researchers at various universities that have studied the impacts of broadband quite a bit.
Right.
So I can also kind of point you in their direction, or even make an introduction if that would be useful. But a lot of it's research coming out of academic institutions.
Yeah, like the
Cool.
Benton Institute, and then also like Pew Research has done a lot of information about that. And then the Benedum Foundation out of Minnesota has also done several different analysis on the impacts of broadband and economic capacity. So exciting stuff.
Wonderful, thank you. I would actually greatly appreciate if those that list of citations could be shared. That'd be awesome. And if not, no worries.
No, I've got it here, and I think we have your email address if you registered, so I'll send it over. Yeah.
Thank you kindly. Appreciate it.
And then there's also, I got a direct message to question from Donna, and she said, there's a lot of funding from many different agencies for broadband. Are there conversations occurring at the federal level between federal agencies to have a consensus on what the federal interest in the projects looks like? And I know that none of us necessarily, well, at least Alex and I do not work in that capacity, but Curtis, if you've got any insight into that.
I do, yeah. So the federal broadband ecosystem is pretty big, actually. You raise, there's a lot of programs that I think we all know about. If you're in the broadband space, you've started to hear about BEAD. There's also, RDOF, some of these acronyms you've probably heard about, but so many federal agencies right now are funding different aspects of the digital equity problem that we have today and we're trying to fix. So every other week, each of those agencies and each program within that agency that's working on this issue has a meeting 3 p.m. on Wednesdays and shares information on this progress of their different broadband programs, different decisions that they've made, different pending awards that they're about to make. And we share information on where we've funded projects and how, for what things we funded those projects for. IIJA built the requirement for all of those federal agencies to be coordinating via some mapping tools. They haven't named the tool yet, but they demoed it yesterday, which is pretty interesting. But fast forward, I don't know how many months until it's built, but there's going to be a map, just like they have the federal broadband availability map now that's at the household by household level. There's going to be a map at the household by household level about federal broadband funding. So it'll show areas that are already funded and already deployed, areas that are funded but not yet deployed, and even areas that just haven't been funded yet, so that we can all make sure that as federal agencies, we're not wasting dollars by funding over top each other. And that's something that, we do spend a lot of time working on. Good question.
I would also say that it would be nice if the agencies coordinated in terms of creating a unified structure for awards and what you look for in applications, but that's probably not going to happen. Many of the agencies have slightly different priorities and methodologies. And so while I think the coordination is better now than it has ever been before, you still have the USDA prioritizing different things, different speeds, when compared to the NTIA or when compared to the EDA, which will give broadband grants to anyone who can prove they can create jobs, but regardless of what the service is like in the community as it is now. So just to add a little bit of color to that, I think we all would like there to be more standardization, but different agencies have different priorities, and so there's unlikely to be perfect coordination.
Very true.
And Curtis was in charge, though.
Yeah. Hey, I can build a process. Let's see. You believe me on that. It will be interesting, and it's BEAD's going to be interesting, and I'm sure we'll talk about this on the week that we talk more about funding. But just the fact that each state is going to have its own different version of BEAD and different flavor of BEAD with their own application cycles and application requirements and portals, and it is going to be. It's not necessarily getting more simple before we get through this huge wave of funding. So it pays for folks to be paying attention and attending trainings like this and getting all the help they can, because it's just going to be an effort.
All right, thank you all once more. Excited to see you again in subsequent weeks. And if you have any questions or anything you want us to cover, do send us a note so we can make sure we get to everyone's questions.